Ana Hashem, ki ani avdecha. Ana Hashem, ki ani avdecha. Ani avdecha ben amatecha, ani avdecha ben amatecha, ani avdecha ben amatecha, pitachta lemoserai.
There was once a king who had a loyal servant named Naphtali. One day the king said to him, "Naphtali, I'm traveling to a faraway country for a long time. I need you to make sure everything in the kingdom keeps running exactly the way I run it when I'm here." The king gave him detailed instructions, said goodbye, and left. At first, Naphtali did everything just as the king had asked. But after a few months, he started giving himself more and more important titles. First, he called himself the king's minister, then the viceroy, and eventually he even announced that he was the king. When the king returned, he saw that things looked fine on the surface, but he never expected Naphtali to claim the throne. The moment Naphtali saw the king, he bowed and apologized sincerely and begged for forgiveness. The king forgave him, but told him that he could no longer serve in his position because he had broken the trust that he had given him. The Torah speaks about slaves and maidservants, roles that were common in the ancient world. In the Torah, which is eternal, these roles aren't automatically viewed as negative, like today. The best-known servant in the Torah is Eleazar, Abraham's trusted aide. Abraham even said that if he had no children, Eleazar would inherit everything he owned. Still, despite Eleazar's importance, when he hinted that his own daughter might be a match for Yitzchak, Avram's son, Avram refused and told him, "I am blessed and you are cursed, and the blessed cannot join with the cursed." Even after this painful rejection, Eleazar didn't rebel or overstep his role. Instead, he prayed to Hashem to help him succeed in finding the right bride for Yitzchak. The Torah devotes many verses describing Eleazar's mission to Haran, teaching us that the conversations of the servants of our forefathers are more precious than the Torah of their descendants. Before moving on to the maidservants mentioned later in the Parsha Vayetze, it's worth adding two more details about Eleazar himself. The first point is that because Eleazar controlled himself and carried out his mission in Haran faithfully, even Lavan called him blessed, saying, "Come, you who are blessed by Hashem." From that moment on, he was no longer seen as cursed, he was blessed. And the second thing is Chazal also teach us that Eleazar, Avram's servant, was one of the few people who merited to enter Gan Eden while he was still alive. In past years, when teaching Parshas Vayetze, I focused mainly on our matriarchs Rachel and Leah, but there are two other mothers I haven't spoken about. Women the Torah mentions only briefly. Even so, we can still learn important lessons from the two other mothers, Bilhah and Zilpah. First, let's look at what Chazal say in order to answer a basic question. Who is included in the title Mothers of Our Nation? In Tractate Brachot it says, there are only 3 fathers and only 4 mothers, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. We often talk about the fathers of the nation, meaning Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Even though Yosef was righteous and exceptional, he and even Moshe Rabbeinu are not included in this title. The patriarchs are only those 3. Another source, Midrash Rabbah, offers a different perspective on significant figures in our history. It notes that the princes brought 6 wagons for the building of the Mishkan, and each number of items had a symbolic meaning. Some say that the 6 wagons represent the 6 days of creation. Others say they represent the 6 sections of the Mishnah. But according to a third opinion, they represent the 6 mothers. According to this source, there is a disagreement. One source says the mothers are only 4, not including Bilha and Zilpah, while according to the other source, there are 6, including those 2. It's possible that the view of only 4 mothers is based on the fact that Bilhah and Zilpah are described as maidservants rather than mothers or wives of Yaakov in the Torah. But even this is not entirely consistent, because several passages in the Torah suggest contradictions about their status. It is told that when Rachel saw that she had not given birth, she wanted to follow the example of Sarah, Abraham's wife, so she gave her handmaid to Yaakov, hoping that through this she would also have children. The Torah says, and she gave Bilhah, her maidservant, to Yaakov as a wife, which demonstrates that Bilhah is treated as a wife, not just as a maidservant or a concubine. Later, when Leah was about to have a child, the Torah says, and she took Zilpah, her maidservant, and gave her to Yaakov as a wife. Here, too, Zilpah is presented as a wife, not merely a maidservant. This raises an obvious question. Rachel gave Bilhah to Yaakov as means to help her have a child, like Sarah did with Hagar earlier. But Leah already had 4 sons at this point, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Why did she give Zilpah to Yaakov? She didn't need a segula or a merit to have more boys. The explanation is that our matriarchs knew through prophecy that Yaakov would have 12 sons from 4 wives. At that time, only Leah and Bilhah had given birth to 6 sons together, so they understood that the remaining sons would come from the other 2 women, and it was clear that Rachel, as Yaakov's chosen wife, would be one of them. Leah believed that for this noble act, she, Rachel, would certainly be repaid with at least 2 sons. For this reason, she gave Zilpah to Yaakov, thinking it was better for the 4th wife to come from within, from Lavan's daughters, rather than from an outsider. Furthermore, at that time, there were no women more suitable for Yaakov than Bilhah and Zilpah, in addition to Rachel and Leah, of course. It's also important to note that none of the patriarchs voluntarily married more than 1 woman. Abraham did so only because it was necessary for Sarah to bear children. Yitzchak did not marry more than 1 woman at all. In Yaakov's case, it was decreed by heaven that he would marry 4 women as revealed to them through prophecy. So what makes Bilhah and Zilpah unique? Unlike Hagar, they were deeply devoted to their mistresses. Bilhah was named Bilhah, which is derived from the word bahala, meaning fear, because she feared the fact that her mistress Rachel was barren, and Zilpah, whose name is derived from the word that means tearing, was named that because she wept, fearing that her mistress Leah would be married to the wicked Esav. This shows that the maidservants given to Leah and Rachel shared their worries and their distress. This sensitivity is quite different than Hagar's attitude towards Sarah. Once she, Hagar, became pregnant, she acted arrogantly towards her mistress. Bilhah, by contrast, never boasted or acted as if she was special because she bore children before her mistress Rachel. She understood that her sons would always be linked to Rachel, and Rachel was the one who named them at birth. The same applies to Zilpah. Our sages say that Zilpah was modest and humble, and she wasn't proud even though she gave birth at a younger age than the rest of the wives of Yaakov. Leah, her mistress, who rejoiced in her births, gave her children names full of joy, God symbolizing good fortune, and Asher referring to joy. Joy at the birth of another son by the wife who used to be her maidservant. So now I'll go through the verses where Bilhah and Zilpah's status is questioned, and I'll try to figure out in which cases they were treated as full women and in which they were referred to as maidservants who had a lower and more restricted status. In Parshat Vayishlach, when Yaakov prepared his camp for the vital meeting with Esav, the Torah says, Yaakov lifted up his eyes and saw and beheld Esav coming towards him with 400 men, and he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 maidservants. Calling them maidservants here contradicts with how they were previously described to Yaakov, as women, wives, not simply maidservants or concubines. Later, in arranging his camp, it says, he placed the maidservants and their children first, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last, showing a different approach in their roles and status. Another source relates to Reuben's misgiving, where he interfered with his father's sleeping arrangement. The Torah says, and Reuben went and slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Here Bilhah is called a concubine, which is closer to the status of a servant than that of a full woman. It's important to state what Rashi and the other commentaries mention in regard to this case, that it merely refers to Reuben moving his father's bed to the tent of his mother Leah, and not that he actually cohabited with Bilhah. Later, when the Torah discusses Yosef, it says that he was 17 years old as he tended the sheep together with his brothers, and he spent time with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. Here they're not called concubines. We will now try to explain the differences in how Bilhah and Zilpah are defined, depending on the context in which they are presented. In the first case, regarding Rachel, the Torah says, and she gave Bilhah, her maidservant, to Yaakov as a wife. Rachel treated Bilhah as a full woman, freeing her from the status of a slave and giving her to Yaakov as a wife, with all the rights involved with this status, not merely as a concubine with reduced rights. Similarly, regarding Leah, it says, and she took Zilpah, her handmaid, and gave her to Yaakov as a wife. Leah also elevated Zilpah's status, giving her full recognition as a woman, generously and with consideration. However, in the case of the encounter with Esav, Yaakov organized his camp carefully, creating a hierarchy for how everybody would be positioned so it would be acceptable in Esav's eyes. He sent gifts of sheep, camels, and other cattle ahead, arranging them carefully to please the eye of that wicked man, presenting them gradually so Esav would be impressed. Then he positioned his family, placing the maidservants and their children first, followed by Leah and her children, and finally the most important, Rachel and her son Yosef, were placed at the end, as was customary and acceptable in those days, that the more precious are positioned behind everyone else. Also, as Rashi notes, it was traditional to present the least important first and the most important last. Even in his careful arrangement, Yaakov remained mindful of his family by positioning himself at the very front. As the first one Esav would encounter, by this he showed that he was the one that takes responsibility for everyone. To draw a preliminary conclusion, we can assume that when it comes to having children and the birth of the tribes, the handmaidens were treated as full free women, but when facing danger or arranging the family before others, the social customs of the time required a hierarchy separating the primary wives from the maidservants. In the next case, when Reuben went and, as if slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, the Torah describes it in this way for a reason. Rashi notes that Reuben merely moved his father's bed from Bilhah's tent to his mother Leah's tent. Prior to Rachel's passing, Yaakov's bed had always been in Rachel's tent. After her death, however, Yaakov moved his bed to the tent of Rachel's maidservant Bilhah. Reuben, believing that Leah had suffered enough from being considered secondary to Rachel, moved his father's bed to the tent of his mother Leah. Because of this, the Torah calls Bilhah his father's concubine rather than his father's wife. If she were called Yaakov's wife in this case, Reuben would have no excuse for interfering. Lowering his status to a concubine allowed Reuben to justify his act by giving preference to a proper wife rather than to a concubine. Later the Torah notes, and the sons of Yaakov were 12, implying they were perfect. According to this verse, which comes directly after the description of Reuben's act, it's evident that all 12 sons were righteous. That is all, including Reuben, and Reuben did not truly sin. Still, on a personal level, Yaakov rebuked him in his final words, saying, "You were hasty like running water," and he was punished by having to relinquish his birthright and the priesthood. Although for anyone else, moving one's father's bed would not be considered a sin, a person on Reuben's level was expected to exercise greater self-control and refrain from intervening with his father's sleeping arrangements, even though his father's choice annoyed and saddened him. The last example concerns Bilhah and Zilpah in relation to Yosef. The verse says, "This is the history of Yaakov. Yosef, who was 17 years old, spent time with his brothers tending the flocks, along with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives." Here the Torah calls them his father's wives, showing a completely different approach than the encounter with Esav. Yosef honored Bilhah and Zilpah and considered their sons equals to the others. By calling them wives, the Torah communicates Joseph's respect as if to say to his brothers, remember, we are talking about our father's wives, not merely maidservants, and their sons are as important as you are. We, the children of Israel, are called both children of Hashem and servants of Hashem. The advantage of being a child is that Father loves you unconditionally, but a child can sometimes take this for granted, thinking, no matter what I do, my Father will still love me. In contrast, a servant demonstrates complete submission and perfect obedience. Like Eleazar, whom I mentioned earlier, a faithful servant sets his own desires aside and sees himself as a tool through which his master acts in the world. To apply this practically, no one can completely escape a state of servitude. Even though we are all children of Hashem, our souls are bound to bodies that limit us, and we cannot always act perfectly according to Hashem's will, just as a child might sometimes fail to do exactly what a parent asks him to. That's when we must activate the servant within us. I know, and I think many of you know, talented men and women who have done enormous good for lots of Jewish people, influencing youths and entire communities. Yet even these great figures stumbled. Despite bringing many closer to Judaism, they themselves fell into serious sins. Why did this occur? These people saw themselves primarily as children of Hashem, feeling confident in their talents and their mission. They didn't sufficiently activate the servant within them, the part that keeps duty and humility first. They patted themselves on the back too much, forgetting that their role was to serve Hashem faithfully. The best guidance, not only for those who are no longer with us, but for anyone facing similar challenges or other difficulties, is to accept the guidance of a rabbi or a spiritual mentor. A knowledgeable teacher or even a female rabbinical guide can help a person understand where to set personal boundaries, the limits of the servant who faithfully carries out the will of the Creator, and in doing so avoids stumbling. I'd like to conclude with an excerpt from a beautiful poem written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Slaves of time are slaves of slaves. A servant of Hashem alone is free. So when every mortal seeks their share, my choice is Hashem, my soul decrees.